05:22 hours. Philippine Sea, east of Luzon. The horizon is a thin blade of pewter, the carrier's wake a stitched seam in green water. Commander David S. McCampbell, CAG 15, slides a gloved hand across the Hellcat's panel by muscle memory. Mags hot, mixture rich, boost where it needs to be. A yellow shirt arcs his arm, chocks jump. The Pratt Whitney catches with a blue cough and settles into that barrel-chested thunder that vibrates your ribs more than your ears. The talker in his headset doesn't bother with drama, just bearing angels, numbers that don't love you. Many bogies, 090. Angels 25, deck timing phrase. A magneto balks on one bird, a fouled spot stalls another, and the neat diagram of a four-plane division dissolves into what carrier war usually is. 2 airplanes that can go now. McCampbell salutes the deck. Ensign Roy Rushing tucks in. 2 blue cats leap into the grey. The day becomes arithmetic. Altitude is a bank account you spend once. They climb until the oxygen masks go sweet and cold, and the Hellcats stop feeling heavy and start feeling inevitable. 6.50 caliber Brownings per winged brute, roughly 400 rounds a gun when you're lucky. Armour glass and self-sealing tanks. An R2800 that still drums angrily where light fighters start to gasp. Somewhere out there, a raid fat as a knuckle is crawling up the fighter director's scope. 50, 60 airplanes, Zeros with their knife noses, Oscars with their swallow wings, herding toward task force decks that look absurdly small from 25,000 feet. The odds are a joke you don't repeat on the radio. The solution is geometry. Hellcat armament/performance, raid scale. McCampbell levels, steals another 100 feet, and rolls the big cat on her back. Gravity writes the opening sentence. The sight picture steadies. A 2-second burst is not poetry. It's ballistics, a cone of heavy slugs that turns a zero from an airplane into parts, a rectangle of aileron, a black pinwheel of prop blade, something helmet-shaped you don't want to identify. He walks the stream to the next, and the second target becomes a confetti cloud. Splash 2, not boast, but bookkeeping, because time and ammo are the only clocks that matter up here. Rushing, steady and ruthless, takes a high-quarter snap and caws an Oscar, the neat surgical line of tracers running spinner to tail. The Japanese chatter tightens, then frays. The sound pilot's ears learn to recognize when a formation discovers it has met threshers, not dancers. 2 against approximately 60, the pair's opening kills. You could once unnerve Americans by saying 0. By October 1944, the Hellcat has changed the conversation. It does not win with elegance, it wins with certainty. Don't turn with them. Don't play their game at 10,000 feet. Take the top, fall like a hammer, convert speed to a zoom climb and reset the fight. The 50s give you time. Half a minute of sustained fire if you're disciplined, while most cannon-armed opponents spend their fury in 3 or 4 seconds and hope. Probability becomes a weapon system. McCampbell shapes the cone, holds the burst through the line of flight, and airplanes cease. Rushing flies Guardian Angel, slightly low, slightly back, peeling threats off the CAG's 6, then cashing in his own shots with miserly bursts that end in black smoke and white spray. Tactics and gunnery logic, sustained fire advantage. The raid keeps moving, momentum of bodies, if not of will, toward carriers that are already swinging into the wind for the next launch, because Task Force 38 breathes in deck cycles, not speeches. Somewhere to the west, Kurita is bleeding in the Philippine Sea. Somewhere to the south, an old battleship admiral is setting a trap at Surigao Strait. Tomorrow off Samar, small decks will do impossible things. This morning's job is simpler and therefore harder. Make sure the hammer never falls. Caps that succeed write zeros on ship damage reports. Their victories travel home as silence. Laties 4 battles frame, CAPs roll. Pass after pass, the sky teaches. A 0 tries to bait a scissors. The Hellcat says no and dives instead, because mass is a weapon when you know how to spend it. Pulling out, McCampbell rolls back onto the enemy's spine and presses a 3-second sentence into aluminum. Armor-piercing incendiaries that first make fuel into mist, and then make mist into a plan you don't survive. An Oscar tries to run downhill. The Hellcat runs faster, then climbs away as if the air has remembered how to hold American airplanes better than others. The vibration of 6 Brownings is its own music, heavy even, reassuring in a way only people who have had to trust machines can understand. Dive zoom geometry, target effects. Some details lodge and wait, the click hesitation of an outboard gun that recovers, the faint, hot electric smell of breeches and cordite mixed, the way an ammunition counter tells truths your adrenaline will try to deny. Other truths arrive later, when men with paintbrushes and checklists make rituals out of survival. The scoreboard on Mincy 3's cowling will get 9 new flags before sunset. The photograph in an official archive already knows the caption, 30 by that date, 9 of them in one action, 24th of October, 1944. In the moment, there is only the next target, and the next decision not to turn when turning is how you die. Scoreboard and 9 in one action documentation. By the 10th minute, the Japanese formation is no longer a formation. It is a scattered weather system of falling things, escorts shepherding no one. 2 Hellcats have broken the head off a morning's worth of trouble. The numbers that make historians smile tight-lipped, 9 for McCampbell, 6 for Rushing, 15 erased by 2, are not the point so much as the method. Altitude kept, bursts short, dives clean, ego leashed. And the larger equation is national. Blue airplanes that can take punishment, armed with guns that don't quit, flown by pilots trained long and fueled lavishly, backed by an engine of production that replaces what breaks before irreplaceable enters the room. That is what lets 2 men harvest a raid meant to bleed a fleet. 15 combined, 2 against many, method over myth. Fuel becomes a character now. Gauges lie in ways pilots understand. They are optimists until they turn coward all at once. The Essex's deck is fouled. Patience is a luxury no one can afford. McCampbell looks at the ocean, all the Pacific that ever was, and points for USS Langley CVL-27. The R2800 is a strong animal that will do what you ask if you speak softly at the right time. He traps on the first pass because there isn't a second to be had. The airplane has to be muscled off the wire because there is nothing left to taxi with. The ordnance gang checks the chutes and finds 2 lonely .50 caliber rounds still aboard. The legends get embroidered in ready rooms, but the bones of it are true. Near empty gas, near empty guns, 9 kills, and a blue machine that did exactly what it advertised. Divert to Langley. 2 rounds left, fuel exhaustion on landing. The rest is ceremony and consequence. For June over the Marianas and for this October morning east of Luzon, McCampbell will receive the Medal of Honor, the only fast carrier task force aviator so decorated, because sometimes the nation answers arithmetic with a small piece of ribbon and metal that says, "We noticed." He will finish the war the Navy's top-scoring ace, 34 in the air, the scoreboard on Mincy, 3 a ledger of what happens when design, training and nerve meet at altitude. But all that comes later. On this dawn, the story is simpler. 2 Hellcats leave a deck and meet a crowd. Geometry, discipline and 6 Brownings turn odds into debris. Carriers breathe easier. The wake lengthens. The day moves on. MOH. Highest scoring US Navy ace, 34. Leyte context. The F6F Hellcat didn't seduce the eye. It bullied the air. At sea level, it was all shoulders and jaw. Steel backplate behind the pilot, armor glass up front, self-sealing tanks tucked where fire most loves to start, wrapped around a Pratt and Whitney R2800 that turned avgas into a kind of inevitability. Slide the throttle forward, and the big radial didn't so much rev as declare a boundary. This far and no farther for anything trying to climb over it. 6 Browning .5s, 3 in each wing, roughly 400 rounds to a gun when the ordnance gang had their way, made the promise legible. Sustained, simple, brutal. In a sky where seconds are currency, the Hellcat brought half a minute of steady fire to a knife fight. The airplane's geometry chose the pilot's tactics. A Zero could pirouette you to death at 10,000 feet if you accepted the dance. The Hellcat refused choreography. Take the top, fall like a foundry anvil, turn speed into altitude again before anyone can sell you a scissors. The R2800 kept its breath where other engines wheezed, Angels 2.5 and above, so the Blue Cat could live in the thin places and come down on its own terms. The gun's long breath meant patience was not a sin. You could wait until the sight ring wasn't a guess but a verdict, squeeze a 2-second burst, and let probability do the rest. The elegant part was how inelegant it all was. Set the Hellcat against its opposite number, and the design philosophies read like dueling manifestos. The A6M0, light and lethal in 1941, carried its genius like a flaw by 1944. No armour behind the pilot, no self-sealing tanks, control forces that turned to iron at high speed. It was a duelist who brought a rapier to a machine gun range. In the hands of masters it could still cut. In the hands of hurried replacements it became a target with good manners. The Hellcat didn't need the Zero to be bad. It only needed the Zero to be what it was. Fast in the turn, fragile in the heat of heavy bullets. Behind the cockpit noise was a quieter music production. Grumman's Bethpage lines rolled the cats out as if the sky were paid by the hour. 12,275 Hellcats in about 30 months, a pace that turned mishap into scheduling and irreplaceable into a word for other air forces. Fast carriers breathe in deck cycles, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch, and airplanes that open wide for wrenches keep those lungs clear. Access panels you could really get a hand into, runs of cable where a night shift chief could see the fray before the dawn launch. This is the part of air combat physics they don't test in wind tunnels, the maintenance geometry that turns intent into tempo. Ammo is where doctrine turns into arithmetic. 650s at a typical convergence, 300 yards for most Navy hands, paint a 6-foot disc with roughly 100 heavy slugs a second. Call the target a box the size of a small car crossing at 300 miles an hour. Now give the shooter 2 seconds of clean trigger and a gun sight that's more muscle memory than glass. The Zero's cannons spit their fury in brief, brilliant coughs. The Hellcat's Brownings hum. It's not that one round is better than a 20mm shell. It's that 30 of them, burning and boring, arrive in a tight, predictable storm that shreds spars, lights vapour, and refuses to stop after the first spectacular puff of smoke. You can hear the design in the cockpit. The Browning's vibration is a steady animal, no temper, no surprise. The R2800's beat under oxygen is drum true. The wing doesn't flutter when you dive past what feels prudent. The ailerons still answer when you pull the nose into the zoom. Survivability is a sound before it's a statistic. The muted thud of hits that don't become fire. The ugly slap of debris against an armoured windscreen that does not spider or surrender. More than one Hellcat returned with holes you could slip a forearm through and an engine that coughed itself back to a straight line. It's not immortality. It's a machine's ability to make your good decisions matter for another 2 minutes, and the machine fit the system it served. Task Force 38's directors moved counters over plots, carving the morning into cap stacks and intercept vectors. A fighter that needed coddling would have broken the ballet. The Hellcat asked only fuel, ammunition, and a place to put its hook. The rest it handled in blunt declaratives. On 24th October, that mattered. 2 airplanes made the launch window while others were still being wrestled into readiness. The big cats climbed to where the raid was still forming, like dough rising, then pressed each pass exactly as the airframe taught them. Down the sun, short burst, no turning contests. The records will put numbers on it. 60 Japanese planes, 15 downed by 2, 9 to McCampbell, 6 to Rushing. But the method is the piece worth keeping. It is what a nation buys when it builds an airplane that bakes patience and punch into the metal. Production turns into training, turns into outcomes. A Hellcat that's easy to build is an airplane you can afford to fly hard in practice. Pilot pipelines lengthen the first time you don't have to choose between tomorrow's raid and today's gunnery hop. The 50's long trigger time forgives early nerves and rewards grown-in discipline. The R2800's surplus of power lets a still green wingman fix a late mistake with a fistful of throttle instead of a prayer. On the other side of the fight, the Zero's acrobatics demanded maestros the Empire no longer had in quantity. A machine that bet on human virtuosity ran out of humans before it ran out of war. Even the anecdotes hide equations. 2 rounds left on landing is legend because it compresses a morning into a number, but what it really says is that the Hellcat let its pilot meet a destruction down to the last pair of cartridges and still get home. Diverting to a light carrier because the Essex deck was fouled, and then having to manhandle the aircraft off the arresting wire because the tanks were dry, is not romance. It's an interface between machine and man that tolerates the ragged edge. A poorer design would have demanded a neat pattern and a second try. The Hellcat let a first pass be the only one. By afternoon, the maintenance crews are already turning method into tomorrow. Armourers relink belts, a PI, a PI-T, ball, the Ordnance Chief's quiet signature in brass and tracer. Plane captains wipe cordite grit from the wing roots, check the gun heaters the way men pat pockets to confirm cigarettes, log the tiny squawks that keep big squawks from happening. Somewhere in the hangar a paintbrush dips and rises, adding little flags in neat rows beneath Mincy 3's canopy rail. The scoreboard is ritual, yes, but also telemetry. It tells you that the physics you chose in a drawing office on Long Island are paying compound interest over Leyte. It tells you that mass, maintained and aimed, makes a sky safe enough for ships to do the slow, important work below. The story pilots carry out of such a day is pared down to grammar you can trust under G-load. Don't turn, dive, short burst, climb, count. The Hellcat wrote that grammar into metal. It is why a morning that should have ended in smoke on a carrier's wake instead resolved into the ordinary miracle of flight ops continuing. Yellow shirts waving, tractors towing, ordnance crews pushing bombs toward other stories. Industrial physics, engines, guns, armour, factories, had reached the point where 2 men with oxygen masks and discipline could remake the odds for an entire task group. On the charts it reads like history. In the cockpit it felt like a machine keeping its promises. Maps make it look simple. 4 blue arrows, 3 red, a few neat anchors along the Philippine littorals. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not a diagram. It was a machine with 4 interlocking gearboxes, each throwing teeth at the other at slightly different speeds. Sibuyan Sea on the 24th, Surigao Strait in the night, Samar on the 25th, Cape Engano to the north, a decoy fleet, a hammer force, a dagger in the south, and a wall of small decks guarding the invasion beaches. McCampbell's morning, 2 Hellcats rising into a wall of oncoming aircraft, lives inside this larger physics. If you don't see the whole board, you miss why 2 against 60 mattered more than a legend on a ready-room chalkboard. Before dawn on the 24th of October 1944, the sky over Luzon was already busy. Japanese operations officers had spent the night assembling strike groups from airfields that once launched regiments and now conjured squadrons. Engines coughed to life along runways at Clark and Nichols. Navigators ran hands over grease pencil lines on kneeboards. Junior pilots checked safety wires with fingers they wished would stop shaking. The order was simple enough to state: find the fast carriers to the east and hurt them badly enough to unbalance the American cycles. The math behind that order was uglier. Too few veterans, too many students, fuel measured in minutes as much as in gallons, but orders aren't solved with math, they're obeyed. To the east, Task Force 38 inhaled. Fast carriers, Essex among them, rolled into the wind, their decks turning black silhouettes into shapes as the horizon went pewter. A fast carrier deck cycle is a living thing. Recover, respot, refuel, rearm, launch, lungs that inhale and exhale steel at set intervals. Radar pickets sent their thin green ribs into the dark, found echoes, called bearings and angels. In the Combat Information Centres, CICS, talkers moved men as counters on the plexiglass plot, while fighter directors turned numbers into vectors. Push one division here, hold one high, commit the rest when the blob fattens. It is not glamorous work, the choreography of other men's heroism, but without the board, the pieces don't find the squares they need. The Japanese board opened in 3 acts, designed to produce one illusion. Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, carriers almost empty of aircraft, prowled far to the north like a matador's cape, meant for Halsey to chase. Admiral Kurita's Centre Force, battleships and cruisers coming west to east through the Philippine Sea, would take the day's heaviest blows from the carrier air groups. In the south, a smaller force probed Surigao Strait, where old battleships and PT boats waited with patient malice. The goal was not elegance. It was to pry open the American shield covering the Leyte landings, distract it above, bleed it ahead, cut it below, and then drive something heavy through the wound. In the middle of that plan lies the reason McCampbell's pair mattered. If the morning raids from Luzon found their marks early, if they broke decks or fouled timing, the rest of the Allied day would stumble. So the first collisions came as shades of grey gave way to colours, plots swelling on scopes, bearings repeated until they were music, pilots sliding into cockpits that felt like clothes. McCampbell's division was supposed to be 4, then became 2. Deck timing always extracts attacks. And 2 went anyway, because the board does not wait for neatness. They climbed into the altitude where the Hellcat's weight becomes an advantage and found the incoming raid still climbing, stretched, a long animal with a fast head and a slower tail. What happened next lives in gun camera film. A high-side pass, a pair of airplanes turned into parts, the formation's rhythm broken, escorts suddenly tending a flock that had become panic. While those 2 blue specks were turning arithmetic into wreckage, the bigger gear set to the west found its grind. Over the Philippine Sea, waves of carrier airplanes from across TF-38 went hunting grey decks. The signals attached to those names have the density of myth now. Yamato, Musashi, cruisers with long knives of torpedo battery. But in the air that day they were rectangles that needed to be squared with bomb craters and torpedo wakes. Dive bombers and torpedo planes found their patterns. Fighters strafed decks, ships twisted and bled. Whether a single sword broke or not, the important truth for the morning was that the carrier machine kept breathing. Launch, recover, rearm, relaunch, because the CAPS had kept the raids from clawing the lungs. Southward, through a night that would read like a professional wrestler's grudge match written in 14-inch shells, Admiral Oldendorf's line waited across Surigao Strait. PT boats and destroyers would draw the first blood, cruisers would rake, old battleships would cross a T with a veteran's satisfaction. That drama had its own page of the programme and did not need help from the morning CAP. But the system did. Enough clean decks in daylight meant fuel and ordnance in the right places at dusk. Clean decks at dusk meant night-fighting destroyers could top off and go take their risks on schedule. A morning intercept can echo 12 hours away along the water. Back at the centre of the board, a smaller piece toppled that would send shockwaves through the day. A single dive bomber found Princeton and turned a precision hit into a slow, fatal fire that would take a light carrier with her by afternoon. In ready rooms across the task force, men heard the news in clipped fragments. Hit, burning, explosions forward, and tightened their hands on coffee cups. The CAPS had not been everywhere. No CAP ever is. but they had been where it counted for Essex at the right minutes, and that fact helped keep the machine coherent while one of its organs failed. It is tempting to narrate Leyte Gulf as the story of brilliant admirals or tragic miscalculations. The truth is closer to logistics with violence. Fighter directors set cap stations like watch springs, Angels 8, 15, 25, so something would always be above the plot line that mattered. Ordnance crews built belts and slid bombs under wings, knowing there would not be time later for perfection. Oilers topped off the ships that would sprint as the lines moved north and south. And in that web of preparation, two pilots could apply a method, altitude, short bursts, no turning fights, to change not just a number of enemy airplanes destroyed, but the tempo of an entire day. By mid-morning, the Luzon raids were weathered down into dribbles, singletons and pairs feeling for a gap that was not there. McCampbell and Rushing were already descending on fumes toward a deck that would not take them, and then to one that would, 2 rounds of .50 caliber still somewhere in the chutes, the sky growing wide again as the engine note settled. Elsewhere, the carrier machine kept moving, strikes to Sibuyan, then north toward Ozawa as the day turned and decisions reached beyond the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the improbable courage off Samar, little carriers and destroyers drawing blood from a giant with a mix of audacity and necessity that still makes the throat ache when you read it. Tomorrow would write another chapter's worth of names. The morning wrote something less cinematic and more decisive. That the fast carrier system, fed and guarded, could keep remaking the day until the enemy's complicated plan collapsed under the weight of American routine. Look again at the board. In the north, the Cape meant to seduce. In the west, the battleships that bled and kept coming. In the south, the trap that would close like a book. In the middle, a task force whose lungs never quite lost their rhythm. And on the far right edge, 2 blue arrows arcing up from a flight deck at dawn, curving into a tangle of red arrows, then breaking them apart piece by piece until there weren't arrows left so much as falling dots. That is the chessboard as it felt to the men who played it. Less about kings and queens than about seconds and bearings and the stubborn grace of a machine that, when protected, could make the sky say no at scale. McCampbell's 9 and Rushing's 6 would get their flags under the canopy rail. Official words would be written later about gallantry above and beyond, about conspicuous intrepidity, about leadership. Those words are true, but their quiet companion truth is simpler. On the 24th of October 1944, while fleets the size of languages sought each other across the archipelago, 2 Hellcats rose into a raid and subtracted it from the day. The board remained balanced enough for the rest of the American plan to happen. In the arithmetic of industrial war, that is what victory looks like. Not a single stroke of genius, but a morning kept ordinary by men who understood their piece of the machine and made it do exactly what it was built to do. The paint on Mincy 3's scoreboard, neat rows of red suns below the canopy rail, was yesterday's arithmetic. The airplane under it was today's proof. Plane Captain Boatswain's Mate, Second Class G.W. Red. Wilson had wiped the last smear of cordite from the wing root before dawn, ran a palm over the gun bay doors to feel for heat warp, then snapped the latches shut with the small reverence of a man who knows his fingerprints will ride to altitude. 6 Brownings, 3 to a wing, belts built, AP, I-AP, I-ball-AP, I-T, in a rhythm the ordnance gang could recite in their sleep. Convergence set where the CAG liked it, 300 yards, close enough to put all 6 rivers into one flood. The Hellcat was not a fencer. It was a punch you aimed. Feet on the brakes, stick back, throttle to the stop. Mincy 3 shrugged loose of the deck and climbed into the cold layer where oxygen tastes faintly of tin and rubber. McCampbell kept the nose a hair above the horizon until the needle said 24,000 and the engine note settled into a steady drum. Off the left shoulder, Ensign Roy Rushing tucked his Hellcat exactly where it needed to be. an elevator ride down if the boss broke hard, a 2-second lag if he fired first. "Tally, tally," McCampbell said, not for romance, but because geometry is a language. The raid was strung out ahead, fast element leading, tail still climbing. A long, dark skein pulled across the morning. He rolled Mincy 3 on her back and let gravity write the opening line. A high side pass is a simple proposition done precisely. Nose just below the bandit's flight path, lead calculated by the small math of experience, 2 seconds of squeeze. The guns did what guns do when the sight picture is honest. Tracers walked up the left wing of the nearest zero, found the cockpit, then the engine. The airplane did not peel away. It unstitched into parts, panel rectangles spinning, a black blade cartwheeling, a blot of smoke that didn't yet know it was a fire. McCampbell checked the pipper right a hand's width and sent the next burst through a second target, still thinking about formation rather than survival. 1, 2, he said, notching time against ammunition. Rushing's voice was a calm in the headset. 1. His snapshot took a crossing Oscar at a steep quartering angle, a pair of short bursts that looked too miserly to kill until the Ki-43's tail separated like paper under a straight edge. He slid back into position the way a hinge returns to closed. Mutual support isn't choreography. It's trust expressed as distance. The enemy moved as men move when surprise hurts them. Some tightened into the middle, some tried to dive, 1 or 2, good ones, tried to bait a rope-a-dope scissors. The Hellcat does not dance. McCampbell refused the bait, let the nose drop, watched the airspeed flick through numbers an early war pilot would have called lies, and then converted the dive to a zoom that put him above the furball again with all 6 guns cooled by slipstream. He picked the next target not by nationality, but by mistake. A zero that had rolled a fraction too late and was climbing into open sky as if the air would apologize. 2 seconds. A PI chewed aluminum into vapor. The immediate halo of white mist as fuel atomized. Then the darker bloom as the incendiaries did what they were made to do. On the 4th pass, the geometry changed. A pair of fighters broke high to meet the American dive, noses up, timing it right. This is where the Hellcats' weight, the thing so many mocked on the ground, paid dividends like a factory worker's Christmas envelope. Mincy 3 plunged past their apex, shrugged off the compressibility tremors that scared lighter wings, and levelled just low enough to make them commit to the down angle. McCampbell rolled up into their 6s as they crossed, an oblique barrel manoeuvre more felt than seen, and stitched the trailing aircraft until the canopy popped away, and the pilot became a falling comma against the sky. The leader stayed intact by inches. Rushing took those inches away with a straight-line solution that would have pleased a gunnery instructor. Now the raid was not a raid, but a constellation of small, desperate fights. Below, escorts had to choose between shepherding and survival. Above, Mincy 3 kept the hill. The method never changed. Keep the sun at your shoulder, see them first. Don't waste altitude on pride. McCampbell counted his bursts in the way his right forearm remembered recoil. 2 seconds is plenty when the sight is true. Anything longer is television for men who think bullets are free. The counters in the panel ticked down like metronomes. He glanced at them between merges without letting the eye linger. You don't watch the hourglass. You feel the sand. And Oscar tried the one thing that can make even a patient man stupid, an invitation to turn at the same altitude. The F6F, honest as a hammer, tells you no in a language of buffet and groan when you try to win the zeros duel. McCampbell kicked rudder, depressed the nose, and used a rolling slice to break the circle. When the Oscar followed, its lightness betrayed it. Control stiff at the speed that keeps you alive in a Hellcat. He flared the pipper across the Japanese pilot's canopy and sent a short, angry sentence from all 6 guns. The Ki-43 staggered, then simply lost its top wing, the spars surrendering to the arithmetic of repeated impact. Between passes he saw small things. Cordite scent leaked into the mask, hot metal sweet. A vibration crept into the left wing as a gun worked itself dirty and then cleared. He made a note for Red Wilson's squawk sheet without words. Down in the corner of the canopy, the Pacific had started to glitter as the sun learned how to be day. Far below, tiny white ticks on grey water, wake foam, told where ships were moving to wind, preparing to breathe again, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch. They went down and up until down and up became measures of discipline rather than direction. In the vertical, where the R2800 still had lungs, McCampbell made the sky a one-way street. If you followed him, you lost speed. If you dove away, he let you go until the next pass found you when you were looking elsewhere. Rushing stayed exactly wrong for anyone trying to sneak a beam, never fixated, his own tally rising by clean, unshowy kills. Somewhere after the sixth pass, the Japanese radio traffic on the common set changed pitch, the oral sign that leaders are dead or busy dying and the rest are flying by nerves. Another pass. Another zero crumpled mid-fuselage, as if a giant hand had squeezed it where spine becomes rib. The gun camera, somewhere later, would show the tracers entering at a tight angle and exiting in a hail that looked like silver rain. He let the wreckage fall without watching it finish. Time is a currency tight to the second when your gauges give you lies with a smile and then panic all at once. On the 9th, he spent the last clean coins, a target trying to climb through clouds into safety, the sight ring a little wide, a 2.5-second press this time, an extravagance that would bother him on the debrief if the ammunition numbers didn't justify it. The airplane blew in halves, tail dancing away like a kite that remembers it's untethered. He breathed once, deep, the way you do when a room goes quiet. Silence in a headset is deceptive. Engines talk, wind talks. What stops is the language of the hunted. The raid, what was left of it, had lost intent. Scattered singles skated for weather. Pairs tried to hide in bright cloud. The carriers below would log the approach as raid broken and dispersed. No flat top would take a bomb from this particular failure of a plan. The two Hellcats slid out of the fight the way a knife slides out of a loaf, clean, leaving absence behind. Only then did fuel and rounds become the only arguments worth having. The Essex deck, busy with men trying to keep the machine's pulse regular, wasn't an option. Langley would be. He set the nose, nudged trim, and listened to the R2800 tell him it could keep its promise a little longer. Rushing tucked in until the last minute, then went for his own wires. On deck, chocks and hands. In the gun bays, ordnance men counting links, then stopping to look at one another when they found what rumour would later make a morality play. 2 cartridges still in the chutes. 2 and not 1. Enough to say the method had held to its last syllable. Later there would be the debrief's sterile nouns, position, altitude, estimated types, and the CO's nod, and the man at the paint locker laying in 9 small flags with a brush so fine the bristles barely held paint. But the chapter had been written in the air, sentence by sentence. Take the top, fall short, fire short, climb away. Refuse invitations. Count. Let the machine you trust make your judgment look like fate. 9 for McCampbell, 6 for Rushing, a raid subtracted from a day. And on Mincy 3's cowl, the scoreboard that meant less than the fact that the carriers kept breathing. 13:05 hours. Ready room, USS Langley, CVL 27. Sweat dries to salt in the canvas of parachute harnesses. Oxygen masks hang like molted skins from chairbacks. The talker chalks a straight line under CAG 15/ENS Rushing, then leaves a handprint of powder on the corner of the board because sailors write with their whole bodies. Debrief is not theatre, it is a factory. You feed it adrenaline, cordite, and memory. It produces integers. McCampbell stands at the map with a grease pencil in his fist and a voice that still carries a bit of engine RPM tremor. Bearing first. Angels. Sun position. High side, out of the sun, short bursts, no turns. He draws a long cigar of enemy formation, head fast, tail still climbing, and slashes it in 3 places. The intelligence officer divides statements into piles. What the camera saw, what the wingman saw, what the pilot felt. Feelings do not get credit. The US Navy learned early that victory tallies cannot be a democracy of impressions. Gun film runs at 16 frames a second. Tracers write dotted lines you can measure with a ruler. The ordnance gang's cartridge count is the truest historian in the room. Rushing is compact in the chair beside him, helmet hair refusing to flatten. He speaks in sentences with verbs that begin and end with numbers. Quartering shot. 1.5 seconds, he marks his first and second splashes with small crosses, not because he's shy, but because the geometry does not care about pride. Mutual support is retold as distance and timing, not heroics. Every I becomes a we by habit. Outside, Mincy 3 cools. The cowling ticks as metal remembers how to be room temperature again. Plane Captain Red Wilson has a clipboard against his thigh and the look of a man who inventories noises. He runs fingers over .50 bores to feel for powder crust, shines a flashlight down feed chutes, and stops when it finds the small miracle the ready room will turn into gospel. 2 cartridges left. Not 1, not 3. 2. The machine and the man used almost exactly what the morning required, no more, no less, and then stopped. In the debrief, the last 3 minutes take the longest. That is always true. You can sketch the first pass in an instant, the feeling when the sight ring becomes a verdict and the guns turn a shape into parts, but fuel is a slow conversation with your own mortality. Divert to Langley, McCampbell says. Recovery at the top of the green. Wire 2. The ops officer circles the words, divert fuel in red, because carriers are living organisms. One fouled deck can ripple through a task group like a skipped heartbeat, unless another organ compensates. The little decks earn their tonnage in moments like this, when big decks are too busy being big to be available. Then the counting begins in earnest. The film spools in the projector's rattle. Freeze. Back 3 frames. That flick of white at the wing root, vapour or fire. The analyst leans close, pencil between teeth, and then nods. Ignition. A hatch blows in the next sequence, canopy detachment that reads as bright geometry against a darker sky. Then a small figure appears and tumbles. Parachutes are not sentiment in these rooms. They are proof. A chute means pilot departed, not pilot survived. Credit is for airplanes destroyed, not men spared. The board writes 9 next to the CAG's name, 6 by Rushing's. The room does not cheer. Naval aviation is suspicious of applause in the middle of a war day. Cheers make holes in concentration. The only sound is the soft clack of chalk on slate and the paper rustle of forms sliding across a scarred table. Somewhere a yeoman is already typing a message set in the clipped grammar of operations. 2 VF-15 AC, engaged enemy raid approx 60. 9 enemy AC destroyed by CDR McCampbell. 6 enemy AC destroyed by ENS Rushing. Raid broken and dispersed. No damage to own forces. Numbers move and the ship moves with them. Ordnance crews feed belts into metal serpents' mouths. A PI, API-T, ball, repeated like a catechism that burns. Fuel lines couple with a slap. The deck gang respots the forward park in patterns that make sense only if you've breathed flight ops long enough to know how a ship exhales. Everything that can be done now is done now, because later is a lie the sea loves to tell. The intel lieutenant takes the long view while the room still smells of sweat and rubber. Luzon fields are coughing up what they can, he says. Pilots are green. Escort plan looked thin. Translation: on the Japanese side, the fleet is spending pilots as if they were ammunition. It manufactures slower than the Americans manufacture airplanes. The Zero was never meant to soak up streams of half-inch fire while trying to duel in the vertical at 25,000 feet. Bury enough experience, and a design that depends on virtuosity becomes a victim of arithmetic. Down passageways and around bulkheads, the ship hums with the slow thunder of implications. A clean morning cap means afternoon strike decks launch on time, and air groups range west toward Sibuyan, north toward Ozawa's ghost carriers, south to keep pressure across Surigao's approaches. Fail in the morning and the day becomes an apology delivered in smoke and rescue nets. Succeed, and your success is recorded as nothing happening to the ships you love. There is paperwork even for miracles. McCampbell signs a combat report that will become archive fodder: time off the deck, time on cap station, fuel load, ammunition load, engagement timeline, assessed types, A6M/Chi 43, estimated strength of the raid, disposition after engagement. He writes tidy. His sentences are mechanics sentences even when they concern killing. High side pass, short burst, observed explosion mid-fuselage. Aircraft broke in two. He does not write the small after-images that we'll visit later, the scatter of parts that look like alphabet, the way sunlight gets cold at altitude when a canopy leaves an airplane and the pilot follows. Those belong to private rooms and quiet hours. Awards officers do not live in debriefs, but someone always has already started a file when a day like this happens. The words conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity exist for the Navy to tell the nation what it noticed. McCampbell's Medal of Honor will read June and October on the same thin rectangle of metal, Marianas and Leyte, because the logic of what he accomplished is single: a man in a machine meeting a crowd and making the crowd less. But medals travel through time slower than airplanes. In October, the ribbon is still an idea. The reality is a damp flight suit and the ache behind the eyes that comes with burning vision and oxygen. Afternoon turns. The battle turns with it. Westward, Philippine Sea takes a beating and gives one back. Musashi will suffer the American habit of repetition: strike, assess, strike again, until magnificent design succumbs to cumulative purpose. Southward, Oldendorf's old battle wagons will practice remembered geometry at Surigao Strait, crossing a T as if finishing a chapter left open in 1942. Northward, Halsey will feel the tug of Ozawa's cape and run, the fleet itself discovering how fast its blood can move. Tomorrow off Samar, carriers that look like toys from Essex's island will write a kind of courage that has nothing to do with airspeed. The chain that connects all of this is logistics, speaking through men. Evening is for maintenance and myth. Red Wilson writes a squawk. Number 2 gun momentary hesitation cleared. Slight vibration in L-wing. Inspect fairing screws. Gun heater leads. OK, the Ordnance Chief signs for 9 little suns to be painted beneath Mincy 3's canopy rail. A PH-2 takes a photograph. Pilot half smile, plainsman at his shoulders, chalked tally still wet. The photograph will end up in a file drawer, then a museum, then in the pages of books where people try to reverse engineer courage from posture. The truth is simpler. Courage looks like a man keeping faith with procedure at 25,000 feet until a problem has only one answer left. Night folds itself over the sea. The CIC plots go dim red. Destroyers take their places on the picket ring like beads on a wire. Somewhere astern, a light carrier limps and burns. Somewhere ahead, black water is about to become white with shell splashes. On Langley, lights are dogged low. Coffee smells fight the ship's paint. The ready room empties. A yeoman puts the day into a folder and labels it with date and time. Another man turns the chalkboard eraser sideways and drags it across the scrawled bearing lines until the slate is grey again, clean, ready to be written on by morning. What lingers is not thunder. It is a kind of silence. The carriers breathe in deck cycles. The fleet sleeps in watches. The war rolls forward on bearings, gallons, pounds of ammo, feet per second, inches of armour, hours on the Hobbs meter, industrial lullabies. 2 Hellcats rose at dawn and subtracted a raid from the day. The debrief turned smoke into numbers. The numbers turned into launch times and strike packages, and finally into the strange arithmetic that makes tomorrows possible. The wake glows faintly in the dark, a seam that says, "We were here, we are moving, we will be there in time." 0605, Philippine Sea. The horizon wore a seam of carrier wakes like white stitches pulling the Third Fleet north. On Essex's flag bridge, Halsey's decision had already leapt from signal lamp to deck crew. The northern force, Ozawa's decoy carriers, would be hunted to extinction. On Essex's island, David McCampbell stepped into the role that didn't earn hash marks on a fuselage but could sink a navy: target coordinator. He would choreograph death in 3 dimensions: altitude, time on target, and ordnance profiles, then ride herd over the furball that always followed. "A conductor with a .50 caliber baton," one pilot muttered, strapping in. His board was a grease-penciled grid, cap stations stacked from 8,000 to 24,000 feet, ingress headings for Helldivers and Avengers, egress corridors bent away from flak sectors that intelligence had mapped around Zuikaku and the light carriers. The plan clicked forward in deck cycles. First wave, fighters to sweep and pin, dive bombers to break decks, torpedo planes to bleed speed, and life from the hulls. Second wave, repeat until the Japanese flight decks no longer existed as meaningful surfaces in the world. McCampbell's voice on the strike frequency was flat steel: call signs, altitudes, timing gates. No hyperbole, only arithmetic. At 0810 the horizon bloomed with black chrysanthemums as 5-inch mounts and 25mm mounts reached for the Essex strike. From his Hellcat, McCampbell watched the first pattern splash near Zuikaku's port quarter, reads off wind and drift, corrects the next stick by 10 degrees. Blue 2, hold your run, flak heavy at bow, shift to midships. Red 3, you're high, nose down, you're dragging. The photographs taken from US planes that morning tell the same story in silver nitrate. Zuikaku underway, deck camouflaged, shrouded by bursting shells. A light carrier, Zuiho in most captions, turning hard as bomb plumes stitch the water. The geometry of ruin was visible even from 20,000 feet. Cheetos died first. Helldivers walked 1,000-pounders up her length. Avengers came low with tin fish, and the sea did the rest. Essex's after-action recollection would later compress the chaos to a single line: struck and sunk light carrier. But in the cockpit nets the description was less clinical. She's rolling, God, she's over. McCampbell passed the word with the same unhurried calm he'd used to count Zeeks the day before. Objective 1. Accomplished. Shift weight to Zuikaku. He had been a duelist on the 24th. On the 25th he was a metronome, setting cadence for a fleet's air arm. By midday the sky over Cape Engano was a dangerous oceanscape of its own. Contrails like whitecaps, gullies of flak, ordnance wakes ploughing toward steel hulls. McCampbell kept the fighter screen taut, interdicting the few Japanese sorties that clawed into the air. More bravado than capability now, the last precious aircraft thrown into a storm already decided. Combat reports from US carriers would later tabulate the mathematics. Repeated strikes, cumulative damage, the slow tilt of Zuikaku toward history's deep shelf. Photographs time-stamped around 1330 show her still making way under a pall of smoke, a destroyer tight off the bow like a sheepdog, and in the distance, Zuiho with her own crown of fire. The hardest thing was to ignore the hunter's itch. He could have dived, could have gone carving through the last CAP to buy one more burst of Roosevelt's piano. But his scoreboard already said 34 by war's end, and on this day the job was not to engrave another serif. It was to erase enemy flight decks. The official tallies, cold and unguilded, would later show no new victory credits for McCampbell on the 25th. None were needed. He was flying the bigger kill, the annihilation of Ozawa's bait force as a coherent air arm. What the camera could not capture was the cadence of the net, his voice spacing dives so the flak predictors slipped out of phase, holding Avengers 3 minutes high and wide because a rain squall would break the light just enough to mask their approach. Pushing a fighter division down the egress lane to cut off a pocket of A6Ms trying to chase wounded bombers to sea. "You don't win this by courage," he had told a new division leader the night before. "You win it by timing." Off Zuikaku's beam that afternoon, timing looked like destiny made practical. At 1400, another wave came off the stacks and down the chutes, SB-2Cs pitching into their dives, the blunt-nosed TBMs crouched on the deck edge like bulldogs, Hellcats shouldering into the wind with that familiar radial engine thunder. The photos taken then show Zuikaku listing, smoke pouring, the sea beginning to claim what Pearl Harbor had once sent roaring into the world. In another frame, an Avenger cuts across a carrier's wounded wake, torpedo doors gaped like a grin. These were not duels, these were executions conducted with industrial grace. McCampbell kept the lid on. He rotated divisions, refused to let any one pilot ride fatigue into error. He sifted the strike chatter for the words that meant retasking. Deck fouled, bomb hang fire, fuel state joker. He routed cripples to friendlies, assigned spare fighters as shepherds. He was not scoring, he was saving. Even a single helldiver brought home with its crew alive was a victory unscored but felt on a hangar deck forever. The historian's pages would call him target coordinator. The men who taxied past his parked Hellcat later called him something else. The reason they lived. By late afternoon, the ledger was written in tonnage and smoke. Zuikaku, last of the Pearl Harbor raiders, mortally wounded. Zuiho torn and burning. Chitose gone to the bottom. The northern force had served its purpose as bait, and had paid the price for it in keels. A Navy photo caption from the day's third attack notes Zuikaku still underway, but listing hard. That she would capsize was already certain. The only remaining variable was how many more of his people he needed to risk to hasten the inevitable. He throttled the next push just enough to finish the problem economically. War, to McCampbell in that hour, was logistics applied at 250 knots. Dusk found Essex bending south again, the strike groups recovered, decks clattering beneath the weight of returning machines. On the ready room chalkboard, the day was a mosaic of unit credits. In the plexiglass headrest behind McCampbell's seat, it was condensation and the faint smell of cordite, and in his throat a fatigue that no coffee could burn away. The 9th of October had belonged to the duelist, the 25th to the conductor. He had proven a fighter pilot could also be a force multiplier, that a calm voice and precise math could sink carriers as surely as 8 Brownings applied at 200 yards. Tomorrow, the fleet would look for more enemy hulls. Tonight, the ocean accepted 3. He signed the strike summary, added nothing florid, and left the column for personal claims empty. In the corner of the page, a clerk penciled the line the squadron would remember. CAG, coordinated Chitose kill, strikes on Zuikaku and Zuiho successful. There are days when history is written in bullet holes and days when it is written in timings and headings. October 25th, 1944, off Cape Engano, was the latter for David McCampbell, who proved that the deadliest hand on the board sometimes holds its fire so the fleet can finish the game. The war does not pause for ceremony. It makes a space the size of a breath. After Cape Engano, after decks went quiet enough for men to hear their own bones again, the machine kept its promises, refuel, rearm, relaunch, south toward other targets and other days. McCampbell's scoreboard on Mincy 3, 30 little suns by the time the photographer caught it with the light just right, was not an epitaph. It was a maintenance record written in paint. 30 became 34 before he was done, not because fate owed him symmetry, but because the factory of war kept putting him where the numbers were. Recognition moved more slowly than airplanes. Paper left the flagship in courier bags. Couriers became planes. Planes became handshakes in rooms where the air did not taste of avgas. The citation spoke the language of capitals, conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty. But what it really said was arithmetic. 7 in one day over the Marianas, 9 in one morning east of Luzon. Leadership that held formations steady while other men's bombs found decks. Early 1945, Washington. A president's hand, a small blue ribbon set against khaki, cameras that clicked like small, thoughtful shell bursts. The medal caught the light the way tracer does. Bright, brief, then back to work. He wore it the way aviators wear everything that isn't a checklist, politely, then out of the way. In war zones, the real decorations were grease under nails and a tunnel of soot along a wing route. On Essex and Langley, the plane captains took more pride in the 9 neat flags laid under the canopy rail than in a medal thousands of miles away. The ordnance chief signed off belt builds with the satisfaction of a man who had tuned a metronome that day and knew it. The R2800S still thundered. The chocks still jumped. The flight deck crew still moved with that grudging grace you only earn by not dying when a wingtip misses you by inches. The Japanese learned the lesson in a different grammar, and it had no punctuation they liked. Their pilots, fewer veterans now, more boys with practiced salutes and thin wrists, went to war in machines designed for a different conversation. The A6M's genius had always been weightlessness and nerve. By late 1944, the Hellcat made nerve alone a poor hedge against streams of half-inch reasoning. Interrogation rooms in 1945 would capture the aftermath in short, tired sentences. We climbed. The American fighters were above us. They dived. Our shells were few. Their bullets did not stop. You can translate overmatched into any language you like. It still sounds like metal tearing. McCampbell's own memory didn't arrange itself by date so much as by texture. The smell of ozone when 6 Brownings heated the air. The way a canopy looks when the pilot who wears it is still inside, and a split second later when he is not. The kind of fatigue that lives behind your eyes, and only leaves when the deck is again under your feet, and the hook's unpleasant violence says you can finally stop solving problems for a few minutes. In the quiet, if there was quiet, he would draw the same shapes in his head that he had drawn on ready-room boards, a cigar of enemy formation, a slash through the top, short bursts counted by recoil, not by faith. He understood the scale that made his particular talent matter, and then made it small again. The Hellcat was a device for turning national industry into local decision. Bethpage and Pratt and Whitney had wrapped factories around the instincts of American kids and given them machines honest enough to keep them alive while they learned. The maintenance logic, access panels that opened without profanity, gun heaters that worked at altitude, self-sealing tanks that made other people's lucky shots less fatal, was as much a weapon system as the guns. There is courage, and there is courage that has been engineered to survive. By the time the Philippines were secure, the fleet had changed shape. New pilots wore squadron patches still wet with ink. New carriers slid into the line as if they had been waiting just over the horizon for someone to nod. The enemy changed shape too, and terrible. Kamikaze wasn't a tactic so much as a confession, and the confession read, "We have spent what you have not, and we have nothing left but men." Hellcats met that too, not with romance, but with stations stacked and eyes outward, the same geometry applied to a different sadness. The Brownings did what Brownings do. The deck crews learned to read the sky for intentions that came straight and did not climb away when they were hurt. The medal followed him around like a polite dog. It meant schoolchildren knew his name. It meant speeches. It meant mothers of pilots dead off Samar or Sibuyan asked him sometimes to tell them what kind of skies their sons had flown in. He would talk about air cold enough to sweeten the lungs, about the way a ship's wake looks from 20,000 feet, like someone has stitched the sea back together, and about how the best pilots he ever knew counted to 2 and stopped. He did not talk about luck, because luck is a rude guest in a room full of people who have done their work well and lost friends anyway. He knew what his scoreboard was and wasn't. 34 is an integer. It fits neatly on a cowling. It tells an honest story about mornings where the sight ring said now and the machine said yes. It does not count the other kills, the ones you hear when an Avenger with a flak-punctured wing makes the groove on a fouled deck because someone kept the egress lane swept, the ones where a division leader new to the role lives long enough to be old at it because a voice on strike frequency spaced dives against the rhythm of enemy predictors. The conductor's totals do not fit under a canopy rail. On land afterward, briefly, then later, long, he discovered something veterans don't always admit even to themselves, that the machine you master begins to master you back. In hotel rooms that smelled of other people's soap, he would wake because the engine note in his head had slipped half a beat. He would sit up until it found the right RPM again. At a desk where the paper did not smell like the sea, he would catch his hand tracing patterns on blotter paper, the geometry of intercepts, arrows and circles, and that little hash that means sun. Decompression for men like him was not silence. It was a slow, patient retuning to frequencies that didn't end in tracers. The war moved on without him in ways he had made possible. Okinawa would be a story told in fire and ash and hangar decks frantic with repair. Then Japan, an end, written by a weapon no pilot could outrun or outthink. In squadron bars years later, when the music got loud enough to make talking optional, men who had flown with him would sketch his virtues the way sailors do, understatement as respect. Never turned when you could dive. Counted his bursts. Didn't hoard glory when another man could use it. When the engines finally went quiet for good, what remained were the numbers and the way he had made them behave. 34 in the air, 9 in a morning that kept carriers breathing, a medal pinned where all could see. And in the logic behind it all, a durable instruction, that courage multiplied by discipline and embedded in a machine fit for its purpose can make a nation's strategy feel like inevitability for the men who have to live it one pass at a time. In museums, Mincy 3 sits polished into memory, the raw sides of war domesticated by wax and light. The placard lists specifications and victories with the calm of a ledger. R2 800, 6.50s 34. Visitors move on. Somewhere a veteran takes an extra second with the gun bay doors, noticing the way they open, the way a hand can get in there quickly, the way heat would have warped them if the factory hadn't overbuilt. He nods, almost to himself. The scoreboard earned its little sons. The machine earned them first. Dawn again, but a different kind of worry. The map that yesterday wore fat red arrows now showed beads, tiny circles strung like a rosary along the approaches to Leyte. Radar pickets, destroyers pushed out into blue emptiness to grow the fleet a longer set of eyes. They were brave in a way that didn't make posters. Their job was to be first to see and, if need be, first to burn. The enemy had changed grammar overnight. Not escorts shepherding bombers, not tidy strike packages climbing to Angels 2-5, but single engines knifing low. Fuel and will measured to the last minute, intent written in a straight line. The word kamikaze had crossed into English with an aftertaste of cordite. The Hellcat had an answer, but it wasn't pretty. You could not duel an airplane that refused to live long enough to lose. You intercepted it outside the picket's gun range, or you counted fires on a horizon you were supposed to keep clean. The fighter director's board shifted accordingly. Cap stations sagged downward, Angels 8, Angels 5, until radial engines drummed at altitudes where humidity lived inside your mask, and the sea was a detail, not a tapestry. Above, a high cover kept the old problems honest. Below, new stations waited to erase straight lines. McCampbell wrote the day with fewer verbs and more prepositions. Between became the most important one. Between the picket and the threat axis, between the sun and the sea glare, between a destroyer's flak bubble and the safe egress lane for a wounded Avenger limping home. He talked timing and tone on the net like a metronome set to caution. Don't chase the splash. Reset the station. Break him off the beam, not across the bow. Short burst. If he lights, he'll finish in the water. The Brownings still made their heavy music. The song's purpose had changed. The Japanese pilots who came now were not always boys, though it comforted rumour to say so. Some were men who had flown long enough to understand what fuel syllables could not explain. They came low because radar loved altitude. They came fast because morality does not apply at 400 knots. They were not aces, they were instruments. The Zero, light and precise, had always been built for hands. Now hands were an afterthought. Down on the decks, men stripped flight ops of ornament. No wasted motion. Belts built like prayers, API, APIT, ball, API again, and slid into gun bays that stayed warm to the touch even after night. On the pickets, someone always said it first. Skunk, low. Bearing. The voice never sounded surprised. It sounded like weather. The destroyer's director swung, the 5-inch mounts elevated, the 40s and 20s woke and talked among themselves. Out on the cap ring, a pair of Hellcats tipped their wings and went downhill, not because downhill is always right, but because sometimes gravity is the fastest counsel you can afford. The geometry was ugly and effective. You don't try to outturn a line drawn with a ruler. You cross it, you put metal in it, you cross it again if the first sentence wasn't emphatic enough. Rushing learned the new cadence as if he had been born to it. He kept a hair higher than his lead to own the second shot, never fixating, never letting the picket rise large in his canopy. Twice in one morning he fired at ranges a gunnery officer would have scolded in school, close enough to count rivets, because the problem in front of him was not elegance, but interruption. McCampbell, who had made a career of refusing bad invitations, refused a new one. The urge to escort every burning wreck to the water with his eyes. He rolled away the instant a target bent wrong, back to station, back to the dull discipline that kept destroyers anonymous on the horizon. On Essex and Langley, the deck gangs adapted too. Recovery windows tightened, respots shortened, the choreography lost its flourishes and found a harder grace. Plane captains taped over shining edges that could catch sun and betray direction to a hungry eye. Ordnance chiefs kept an extra belt per station on the catwalk so that a quick turn could be quick in truth rather than in promise. The sound of a flight deck became a rougher symphony, fewer pauses, more drum, and the men who worked it grew a new patience with the kind of fatigue that hides inside competence. The enemy's arithmetic had one mercy. A line that does not climb cannot surprise the high cover. McCampbell stacked his sky like scaffolding. If a runner slipped the low net, another waited above to hammer him into a different equation. In the ready room, the brief shaved words until only function remained. Bearing, speed, deck status, fuel state. The debriefs were stranger. Crashes make poor film. Interceptions at mast height were more likely to be remembered by men with powder burns than by gun cameras that saw sky and splash and not much between. Claims looked smaller on paper than the fires smelled on the wind. Nobody minded. Red Wilson's world changed in inches. He felt for loosened screws around the gun heaters because sea-level sorties made condensation an enemy. He polished canopies not for pride, but for a cleaner sight ring against grey water. He ran a thumb along a tire's sidewall and felt the scuff that says the pilot didn't quite love the wire, but the wire loved him back. The squawks were smaller, subsurface. A bulky magneto that showed its temperament only when the pattern went tight, a shell link that chewed paint inside a chute where paint had no right to be, a heater lead that needed a lashing of friction tape because the horizon was chewing men today, and there was no time to replace the harness. Doctrine caught up to reality at the speed of men willing to admit yesterday had been wrong. Fighter directors learned to trust picket eyes enough to commit early, even if it meant thin stations for 5 minutes on the other side. Destroyer skippers learned to hold fire a heartbeat longer when friendlies crossed the bow at suicide altitudes, then to open up with a ferocity that did not try to thread needles but made new cloth. Pilots learned a fresh humility about seeing. Sea glare is a liar, and the target you spot at 2 miles is already too close if you were daydreaming about glide slopes. Everyone learned to say kamikaze without ceremony. Giving a thing a solemn name is how you make it ordinary enough to kill. By afternoon, the new arithmetic had written its sum: pickets bruised but alive, a handful of wakes burning out to their blunt ends, a deck cycle that had bent but not broken. The fleet inhaled again, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch, because that is what industrial war does to terror. It absorbs it into schedule. There were losses, and they landed hard. A destroyer with her bow dented like a tin cup, a section leader who didn't jink a second time because there was no second, a chaplain moving from wardroom to wardroom with a book thinner than he liked. The machine did not pretend these were acceptable. It simply integrated them and went on. At dusk, McCampbell sat with a mug that smelled like ships and stared at a board that looked like a city's wiring diagram. He had been built to hunt. Everything in him leaned toward the clean abstraction of altitude and angles, and yet the day had asked him to be a firewall. He found he could be that too. The ledger for October would show his 9 in a morning, his orchestration over Engaño, and then a run of days where his victories wore no flags under a canopy rail because they were counted in ships that didn't burn. He thought about that and found he liked it. Night brought its own tests, and they would answer those as well. Cap pushed out along Blackwater, LSO paddles cutting arcs under red lamps, destroyers ghosting where the horizon had been. But the new word had been caged for the moment, its sting blunted by geometry and habits, and men who breathed on the edge of someone else's tragedy without turning it into their own. On the picket line, a destroyer's bridge ran dim and quiet. A talker adjusted his headset. A captain lifted his binoculars and saw what he needed to see. Nothing. On Mincy 3, the gun bays cooled. The belts hung slack in their chutes the way muscles do after a hard run. Red Wilson wrote a neat line. Clean, load, inspect heaters. Tires check, fuel as directed. He patted the cowling as a man pats a dog that has done its work without fuss. Nearby, Rushing flipped through a thin notebook and made a small hash where only he could read it. Not for a kill, but for a stop. McCampbell closed the ready room door behind him, and the ship seemed to exhale. War changes shape, the machine adapts. Courage becomes a new kind of patience, and somewhere out beyond the last picket, darkness lay flat and harmless for one more watch because 2 blue airplanes had turned straight lines into smoke before they could learn to curve.